Kenmore Asylum, also known as one of Australia's most haunted locations. You may have seen photos of this place, you may have seen videos of this place, but this incredibly beautiful behemoth of a hospital has a dark side. Today we're going to be talking about the dark history of Kenmore Psychiatric Hospital. Kenmore Asylum, also known as Kenmore Hospital or Kenmore Psychiatric Hospital, is a heritage-listed, decommissioned psychiatric hospital located in Goulburn, New South Wales, Australia. Having started its life in October 1879, the Kenmore estate was purchased by the government for £1,252. Frederick Norton Manning, who was appointed the colony's Inspector General of the Insane, purchased the estate, making it his first major achievement in his new role. A new hospital for the site was planned. The first constructed wards were intended for chronic cases which have accumulated in existing hospitals from the southern districts of New South Wales. Several concerns were raised about the possible location of the hospital, as it had little water supply and a sewage system that wouldn't be able to function without tainting the main water supply of Goulburn. The estimated cost of building the asylum was £150,000. The cost was to be spread over a 5-year period, and up to 650 patients could accommodate it. The construction contract started in 1894, with a number of brick buildings as well as a few temporary wooden structures. In one of the contracts, it stated that there was to be a small special ward to be built. This was to contain often violent and uncontrollable patients. Although the first patients to be admitted here were chosen because of their quiet nature, the violent and uncontrollable patients were to be kept under lock and key. By the end of 1894, the asylum was ready to be temporarily opened, with around 140 patients, but several wards of the hospital were yet to be complete. In January of 1895, the first personnel for the asylum were officially appointed, and upon opening, 152 patients from other hospitals were transferred to Kenmore. Of those 152 patients, 146 of them were male. Despite several wards being open for operation, the asylum was on track to be finished by 1897. By 1896, a considerable amount of work was made, and the builders hoped to get through their contract by the end of the year, despite only intending to complete 1/3 of their work. In addition to all that was going on, a bunch of new temporary offices and quarters were made. This composed of 2 officers, 17 attendants, 2 cooks, a needlewoman, and a laundress. Furthermore, progress was made in 1897 with the completion of the main building, and Kenmore Psychiatric Hospital started to resemble a small town. A new contract was also made, and it composed of a nurses' and attendants' home, which stand on either side of the administrative block and thus would complete the front part of the asylum. The remainder of the work primarily consisted of additional wards which stretched outwards towards the river, forming the V shape from the central quad. In 1897, 150 male and 42 female patients were living at the asylum, and by 1901, Kenmore Asylum had finally been completed. By the start of the 20th century, several deaths began to plague the asylum. In 1902, a patient by the name of Henry George Bailey committed suicide by hanging himself from a window shutter using a thick canvas rug by tearing a piece off of it. These rugs were specifically made to be strong as they were used against the violent patients. Due to his violent and homicidal tendencies, Bailey was visited every half an hour. At 5 o'clock, they saw Bailey sleeping in his bed. 25 minutes later, when an attendant made their round, they found him hanging. An inquiry was made to determine the cause of death, and it was ruled that it was suicide. A year later, a second patient who was admitted to the asylum had died. The coroner had found that the patient had died due to suffocation from an epileptic fit. In 1908, a patient was attacked and killed by another resident at the asylum who struck him in the head with a holy stone. The patient, Prince Dean, had a history of hitting other residents and stated that he did it for fun. At the time of the incident, the victim, John Kubit, was scrubbing the floors with Dean. In 1917, a patient by the names of James Claxton hung himself from a tree. Despite being noted as a quiet and sociable patient who never had any desire to commit suicide, 2 years later, a pneumonic influenza spread across the asylum, killing over 21 patients. In 1920, Alston Paul Broom was sentenced to death for poisoning his wife at her visit to the asylum. It was suspected that he was cheating on his wife, and he wanted to remarry but couldn't afford the divorce costs, and so he poisoned his wife. Nowadays, the asylum lays abandoned. Although it was purchased by Australia China International, their plans have fallen through. There were talks about them turning it into a retirement village with government facilities and parks and so on and so forth, but nothing has happened. The community of Goulburn has rallied multiple times to try and get the word out there, but it still lays abandoned. In 2005, it was added to the Australian State Register. If you enjoyed today's Dark History video, consider watching more here.